I'm joined now by Efosa Aluyi, co-managing partner at Astran Global Investments, to review some of our top stories in more detail. Good morning, Efosa. Great to have you on the show.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Morning. So we start with one of your favorite topics, China. But China and the US. So they've reached this agreement.
Yeah.
And fentanyl, rare earths, and some other things. Mm-hmm. But, China actually controls 70% of global rare earths supply. So it's still in a very strong position. I mean, given all the other issues, the issues that they have with the US over Taiwan, some of the other technology-related issues, how sustainable do you think all of this, given all those issues remain unresolved?
Yeah, I think one of the major things that I came away with this week, particularly looking at before the meeting and then after the meeting, is the shifting power dynamic between the United States and China. China now seems to kind of hold the ace, if you will, particularly with this rare earth issue. At the beginning of this week, the idea was that Xi and Trump would meet and then they will be able to actually reach a final deal on rare earths, on soya beans, for instance, on the fentanyl issue as well. But if you look at what happened at that meeting, what China did was to defer, export restrictions on some rare earth minerals.
Right.
Now, he came out with that initial proposition or that initial move in April. There were about 12 rare earth elements on that list. China is deferring export restrictions on only 5 of those.
Okay.
Right? Export restrictions remain on 7 of those. And like you said, China actually controls and accounts for about 90% of rare earth.
It's actually 90%. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Globally. And if you look at the rare earth situation, it's one that I think that the US gave up long ago because the entire process has very significant impact on the environment,
Sure. The
mining
entire process
it,
of extracting
it, refining it. And China, kind of doubled down and dug deep in that place. And that's becoming a significant strategic advantage.
So when
for
you
them.
said the US gave up, the US had the potential to
absolutely.
mine and
The US,
extract.
40 years ago, the US was the largest processors of rare earth in the world.
Yeah.
But because of environmental concerns, they thought, let's let someone else do this dirty work.
Sure.
Right? And then not realizing that this could become a strategic advantage for a country like China.
So, I guess I said, given the same thing we're seeing on the sort of oil side, Trump being sort of pro-fossil fuels, it would, even if the US government was going to say, let's go back strategically to start the miners, it's going to take time for them to ramp up and ever get near where China is.
That's not even something you want to do strategically. China is long gone. That ship has sailed. You can't even... So in terms of the deposits, China has by far the largest. In terms of the capacity, to mine and then to refine, one thing that China also did was to restrict its workers from working outside of China. So the people in China that have gained rare earth extraction and refining
all
experience,
within China.
You can't work outside of China.
Okay, interesting. Now, the flip side of this is Donald Trump also said something which we've heard before. He said China also agreed to buy significant amounts of agricultural products. Now, we've heard this before.
Yeah.
Are these just deals on paper? Are these just agreements on paper? How are you going to sort of monitor, enforce, verify, whatever the case may be?
Yeah, again, like I said earlier, the power dynamic is really shifting, right? China stopped purchasing soybeans, particularly soybeans from the US. Now, China is the largest consumer of soybeans. The US is the second largest producer behind Brazil. So China then significantly ramped up its purchases from Brazil and Argentina. And what you have in the Midwest of the US, Idaho, Wyoming, and those states is that the farmers have produced bountifully and China isn't taking up, that production. So they are unable to sell. So that move by Trump is actually more political.
Right.
Because those farmers are literally stranded. They need China to buy those things. So that's why it was a priority for Trump to have China, take up more soybeans. I think they would, but it remains a bargaining chip because China can come, another day and decide, you know what, we're not buying anymore. And if you look at the entire trade negotiations between the US and China this time around, it's been very uncertain, a lot of fits and starts. You hear that a deal has been reached, all of a sudden China decides to renege. At the core of this, really, is what you want to describe as a power tussle between the US and China. It is soft, and I do not think that the US realizes it very clearly. China has been more strategic about it, and they seem to be having the upper hand here.
Yeah, interesting times. So fascinating, these trade wars. But let's move on to OPEC. Now, it's a really interesting one for OPEC because I'm not sure whether this is a risky move and it might lose market share. So we've had about 5.85 million barrels of cuts, but we've only had about half of that released. So much smaller than we expected. Why this strategy? And does this risk further diluting the OPEC's group's sort of influence in the market?
I think the issue really is around, global demand, right? The expectation is that global demand would actually weaken going into next year. Now, like you rightly pointed out, OPEC since April has brought back about 2.2 million barrels. Of the 5.85, you had essentially three elements there. 2.2 were voluntary cuts, 1.65 were from large countries, and another 2 million was from the entire group itself. So that 2.2 has been brought back. Elements of the 1.65 have come back already. Now, you're bringing back supply into a market where the demand is going to weaken. So you also have to think about prices. So what OPEC had done between April and now was to try and claw back market share. But then again, at this point, you now begin to look at the fact that, okay, we still have this level of market share. Are we not going to think about prices? Because if we look at oil prices, they are down 12% year to date. As a matter of fact, that picture would have been worse if not for the move that we saw this week, just on the back of US sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil.
Absolutely.
Before that, oil prices had really come off quite significantly. So again, those are the considerations that OPEC Plus is having, and that's the reason they are leaning towards, smaller production coming back on stream. Because you can't be putting back barrels into a market where demand is weak.
Yeah. Interestingly, the two leaders of this strategy are Russia and Saudi. And if you look at both countries, they sort of have fiscal pressures. Russia is in a war with Ukraine. It needs revenue to finance that war effort. Saudi has been pursuing this 2030 vision. We've seen all the interesting pictures and scenes from the Future of Finance conference in Riyadh. So how long can that unified front really be maintained within OPEC? This is looking at OPEC now from a more strategic perspective before we see some fractures within the coalition.
And if you cast your mind back to 2020 when crude oil prices collapsed, it was as a result of fractures within the coalition. They were not able to agree around production cuts and all of that. Now, the truth of the matter is that these members, like you said, they have fiscal pressures. So you have to be mindful of the pricing. You can decide to bring back these barrels to the market, but at what price? So if crude oil prices, for instance, drop significantly, your fiscal pressures remain. So another significant thing that has also sort of upended the oil market over the last decade has been the shale producers in the U.S. The U.S. has emerged as the largest producer of crude oil in the world. And you have a drill, baby drill mantra in the White House. So you're going to get significant supply coming from that angle, while prices are sort of at risk. And then you also have to juggle, your own market share with the prices. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act for OPEC and OPEC Plus. But I suppose that they will continue to just monitor things as the situation, unfolds and progresses.
Yeah. Speaking of Saudi, we had colleagues in Saudi at this conference during the week, and this is against the backdrop of different things. You have Gaza on the one hand, regional tension simmering. And this is a very strategic platform for Saudi, right? Because, like I said, it has this Vision 2030. It's trying to diversify its economy. It also is sort of positioning itself as the world's new AI hub. How much of this is more geopolitical high talk than versus actual, real, tangible investments and projects that can materialize for a country like Saudi?
Well, the truth of the matter is that a lot of it really is geopolitical posturing. But geopolitical posturing can be very important at the end of the day. It's been termed the Davos in the desert, right? So what Saudi is doing, again, is essentially galvanizing minds around its 2030 vision. Make no mistakes about it, the AI revolution is here to stay. And one of the things that I think Saudi is also trying to champion, particularly for the global south, is that inclusion, because we're seeing very significant investments in AI, particularly in the United States, right? So what Saudi, I believe, is trying to champion is to ensure that, the global south doesn't get left behind. And once things begin to trickle down into the global south, Saudi would be in the forefront of that.
Yeah. So we had some of our colleagues interview Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, and one of the things she said about global trade, that this is the biggest disruption we've seen in global trade in decades. But she still also argues in the same breath that she's less pessimistic, because she said, based on their research, that much of global trade still operates under multilateralism, WTO rules.
Yeah.
You know, how do you sort of read this, given your experience of countries like China and that backdrop of the WTO? You know, are we moving generally towards more protectionism, or is there a force that is sort of counterbalancing that? And is that the WTO?
Right. So if you look over the last 10 years, global trade has grown at an average of about 2.3% yearly. We have had what I would describe as phases over the last 10 years. We had a really strong growth phase between 2015 and 2018. Well, the value of global trade went from about 21 trillion to about 25 trillion. We then had the pandemic slowdown, obviously lockdowns, supply disruptions, and then we had a period of consolidation. Now, the WTO and the IMF, they created what you call the TPA, right? That's the Trade Policy Activity Index. What that index does is to kind of monitor the evolution of trade and trade policies. It serves as an early warning signal, really, to governments and to policymakers as to how trade is evolving. I think I align with what she's saying around, the biggest threat to global trade over the last couple of years really is around what we're seeing around tariffs and all of that. Now, if you look at that TPA index, it's been on the rise over the last couple of years, and it's just reflective of the fact that we're getting significantly more interventions in global trade, right? Protectionist policies against the backdrop of, what you're seeing with global regionalization. So you're seeing the BRICS and all of that, the Asian nations, they are trading more amongst themselves. So global trade really has actually proven resilient, because if you look at what has happened last year, global trade stood at about 33 trillion. The expectation was that it was actually going to simmer off this year, but it has proven resilient. Nevertheless, these points around that index significantly increasing continues to remain. Protectionism, I think, is on the rise. The only thing there is that the structure for global trade has been built brick by brick over the last 80 years. Right. It's not something that can be undone very quickly. Nevertheless, the impact would be that you're going to see a significant reduction over the next couple of years, particularly if countries continue to maintain this posture of protectionism. Yeah. And we think it really is on the rise.
And it's interesting. I would also argue that the sort of trajectory or dynamic of global trade is tied to specific superpowers and their own political ideology and outlook.
Absolutely.
And so that may also shift, maybe not fundamentally at the roots, but that may also shift depending on who the major governments in power that they are. Now, I want us to touch very briefly on one of the things Alhaji Aliko Dangote said at the Saudi conference about the fact that he thought the energy transition was like 15 to 20 years away. In my mind, I'm thinking, what do you expect the mogul who created Africa and the world's biggest single train refinery to say, right? But what are your thoughts on 15 to 20 years away and his questioning of the viability of electric vehicles given the power supply challenges we have on the continent?
So again, I think like you alluded when it comes to global trade, this whole energy transition thing is actually probably more political than it is economic. And if you cast your mind back to the Biden presidency in the White House, it was left and right and center. It was the talk of town, green energy and all of that. And then that administration is gone. You now have an administration that doesn't necessarily favor it. And it seems to be taking the back seat, really. So again, it is going to be very, very political. The truth of the matter is that, yes, energy transition is already happening. It's on the way. The pace at which it happens, the speed with which it happens, will largely be determined by the political powers that sits in,
Yeah,
places.
I agree, because that drives investments. But if we take a few, maybe I wouldn't say isolated examples, Norway, for instance, about 75% of the cars on the roads in Norway are electric vehicles. Yeah. Right? So it's a reality for some economies. And more economies are diversified in terms of their fuel mix and the sources of energy. So I guess it's probably more of a case of Africa charting its own course in terms of its own transition strategy, certainly, because nobody would argue that the Dangote refinery has been transformational.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And the source of that transformation is crude oil, right?
Absolutely.
So
the truth of the matter is that each region, I think, would have to be on its own path when it comes to that energy transition. But there are countries and economies that are large enough to tilt things and to move people.
Absolutely.
Like you highlighted Norway, great job, but that impact on the globe is not so great. If that was happening in the US, for instance, or more in China, you're going to see more of that
China
impact.
has quite a large EV industry.
Oh, absolutely. But
it has a balanced sort of approach.
Exactly. So again, I think the impact of that and how quickly things happen will really depend a lot on the politics that's at play. But I think for Africa, it would take some time, really, because the truth of the matter is that we really just need energy.
Yes, we do.
We just need energy.
We do.
At this point, there's not so much concern around whether it's EV.
Yeah.
We just need energy.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I was at a conference recently and we're talking about energy, renewable energy and mobility. And the reality is the more you do grow your renewable energy, the more options you have for charging EV infrastructure, right?
Absolutely.
And if you're then using gas as well, you also have that as an option to power the charging infrastructure for EV infrastructure.
EVs,
so you could use gas, you could use power, you could use the grid when it's available. But great discussion, insightful as always. Thank you so much, Efosa,
Thanks for
being with us. Thank you.